good afternoon, everyone. My name is Anne Daghoek. I will be hosting this webinar on behalf of the EU AIMS communication team. I'm very delighted to introduce Dr. Meng-Chuan Lai. Meng-Chuan is a staff psychiatrist at the Center for Addiction and Mental Health and the Hospital for Sick Children in Toronto. He's also an assistant professor at the Department of Psychiatry of the University of Toronto. Meng-Chuan will discuss today why sex and gender are important for understanding autism. Meng-Chuan, please go ahead. I look forward to your talk.
Thank you, Amber. Good afternoon or good morning, everyone. It's great to have this opportunity to discuss this very interesting topic with all of you. I see we have lots of old friends and new friends joining, which is great. So feel free to leave your questions as Amber just directed. So we're going to talk about why sex and gender are important for understanding autism. I would like to bring up an issue about we are living in a world that is gendered. When I say gendered, is that we have a binary conceptualization of sex, which is males and females. And then this turns into social, cultural, and other behavioral aspects that also contain some powered structure we termed gender. We tend to consider it as binary, but actually there are lots of variances within the construct of gender. And this is just an example from National Geographic that now we know there are lots of different gender identities or gender expressions in human beings. The important concept is sex does not equal to gender. The general idea is that sex refers to the biological construct that serves as one of the foundations of gender. But if we want to analyze it more closely, sex actually is not one construct. It represents several different processes. So thinking about sex, there are factors related to the chromosome which has an impact on the hormonal system. And if we want to analyze some of the effects of sex to an endpoint, for example, our neurobiology or our behavior, those can be direct effects from either. But again, there can also be effects of sex to other physiological features that has an indirect effect to our endpoint, which is behavior or neurobiology. What is more important is that sex serves as a basis that human culture created a system called gender, which comes back to our endpoint and has impact to all these issues. So for our scientific inquiry, what is important is actually to recognize what are the multiple variables underlying sex and gender, and then understand what are the characters that having an effect or moderating effect of our variables of interest. Another important concept to look into is when people talk about sex differences or gender differences, it is actually different from another term called sex dimorphism. Sex dimorphism came initially from the animal literature referring to that you can tell an animal's sex based on one particular feature, for example, the sex organ. However, for the human characteristics that we're analyzing or studying currently, there are at most and almost on average sex differences at the very least. So it is important to recognize these differences in understanding the literature about the angle of sex and gender into autism research and beyond. But also, it is also important to recognize that sex and genders do not equate each other and they're not always binary. Unfortunately, we need to recognize that the past literature and even the literatures we're going to talk about later are still mostly treating sex as gender, and they are mostly treated as a binary variable. So this is something that we have to keep in mind interpreting the literature later. So the topic today is about why are sex and gender important for understanding autism. The first obvious reason is really the statement that autism is a male-predominant condition, and I'm going to examine this later. The second angle is about the statement that actually comes up quite frequently, recently, girls and women present their autism differently from boys and men. The other claim that we heard often nowadays is that autism in girls and women are under-recognized. In general, this blue area represents how sex and gender or sex and gender related variables moderate the identification and the presentation of autism. I would argue this is one important angle, but different from the second angle I'll be talking about later. Now, in the green box, we see there are claims that actually more are there longer than the blue one, stating that female sex or gender protects one from developing autism. This is a direct inference based on the fact that autism is more prevalent in males. Now, the inference there then is females need more risk hits or biological changes for them to develop autism. This is a general claim, but if we want to look into it more deeply, then one may suspect that specific mechanisms related to this phenomenon, what is called female protection, could be factors contributing to typical sex differences or gender differences, such as genes, hormones, socialization, are involved either in the etiology or in the developmental pattern of autism. So the green box represents a second category of inquiries, which is how sex and gender-related variables moderate the biology, developmental mechanisms, or etiologies of autism. So let's start from the very first one. There's a claim that autism is a male-predominant condition. My argument to this is yes, but it's not hugely, and many females may be under-recognized in the past. The strongest evidence probably comes from epidemiological study. So if we read the latest literature or we read textbooks, we always read this line saying autism is more prevalent in males and the male-female ratio is about 4 to 5 to 1 nowadays. Thinking about different kinds of epidemiological studies, the first kind of epidemiological study is called in-depth population screening. So researchers go into the general population, do a screening, then ascertain people who are above the screening cutoff, and then conduct a more in-depth clinical interview to determine diagnostic status. There's a second kind, and actually more prevalent kind of epidemiological study, which are based on data collected from medical records in registry or sampling data from available records in hospitals or in education systems. In which case, the researchers do not go into the population directly screening for everyone or a randomized representative sample, but they rely on existing sample that has been ascertained by the existing medical or education system. It is interesting to look into the data and to see what are the differences. And this has been demonstrated quantitatively by a recent systematic review and meta-analysis by Looms et al. From Will Mandy's group at UCL. What they did is they analyzed all the existing epidemiological studies in autism and trying to find out what are the sex and gender ratio of autism prevalence. Overall, they do find about 4.3 to 1 male-female ratio overall, which meets with the description in most of the literature. However, if you divide the studies into two kinds. One is what we call the active case ascertainment, which represents researchers going into the general population and doing an unbiased screening. You see a sex ratio of 3.25 to 1, which is lower than the 4 to 5 to 1. Then, if you look at the studies using passive case ascertainment, mainly getting numbers from existing registry or surveillance data, you see a ratio of 4.56 to 1. And the two confidence intervals do not overlap. So the main idea here is that there are some girls or women that are missed if you rely on the data using passive case ascertainment. It is only when you go into the general population, then do an unbiased screening, then you see more females identified. So this is a clear evidence suggesting that although there is a sex bias or gender bias in terms of more males are diagnosed with autism, it is not as huge as people perceived before, but there is still a male bias of about 3-to-1. Second question regards to what we talked about, sex differences or gender differences in behavior manifestation. So the latest claim is girls and women present their autism differently from boys and men. And I would say that it is possible, but it depends on what it means by differently. Now, I would like to talk a little bit about more abstract level of thinking. So when we talk about measurement or behaviors defining autism, as we know, autism is currently defined by behavior presentation and characteristics. There are 3 different levels. The first level, what we call broad construct, refers to what defines autism at the most high level, abstract level. So based on DSM-5 concept, for example, autism is defined by issues or difficulties related to social communication and social interaction at the first level. And the second one is repetitive stereotype behaviors and sensory idiosyncratic responses. By definition, these 2 high-level things should be independent of sex or gender, or then we will be defining autism differently from the very high level from the very beginning for males and females. Now, if there are sex or gender differences, there are 2 possibilities. One, sex and gender differences lies in what we call narrow construct, meaning that the symptom or behavior characteristics organized differently in males and females. It could be the case that the subdomains contributing to autism are organized differently in males and females, or the associated issues, for example, the level of anxiety, level of emotion regulation issues, organized into the other autism-related characteristics differently by sex or gender. The other possibility is that males and females present their autism characteristics similarly at all these above levels, but the actual behavior presentations differ based on their sexes or genders. We have some data suggesting that at the narrow construct level, meaning the organization of the characteristics, do not differ a lot in males and females. There are not many studies looking into this, but at the very least, the study by Fraser and Harden just published recently using the Simon's simplex collection, showing that if you organize autism-related symptoms using some of the ADAR and SR items, you see measurement invariance, meaning that the scores coming from the combination of these ones can be interpreted directly between males and females. There's another study showing this on the version of autism spectrum quotient. However, we still do not have study looking into how associated characteristics such as anxiety, ADHD, or emotion regulation issues are organized with other autism characteristics differently by sex or gender. If we use the standardized tools that people commonly use, for example, ADAR, ADOS, SRS, AQ, and others, a general pattern that was found in the literature was that females tend to show less repetitive and stereotyped behavior measured by these standardized tools. So that could be lower restricted interest, or in some other studies, lower repetitive behaviors, and so on. However, when it comes to social communication abilities, it varies a lot by the developmental level or by the age of the participant. It is also worth noting that for the lower repetitive and stereotype behavior measures, it is not modulated by the individual's intellectual functioning. And this is an example from our very own EUM's Longitudinal European Autism Project, LEAP. In this data, we see that the distribution of autism characteristics measured by the ADOS actually are quite wide across different age ranges and intellectual abilities. Sex differences actually are not having great effect sizes, and it is actually only in adolescent group that we have a statistically significant group differences in terms of males having higher scores compared to females on the ADOS. So this marks that although, in general, there is a lower level of repetitive stereotype behaviors measured by the standardized tools, it is not huge effect. And regarding the other domains, it varies a lot based on the individual's age or other characteristics. However, there are people arguing that the measures measuring autism-related characteristics are created based mainly from male participants, historically. There might be some female behavior presentations that are not well captured by standardized tools. We summarized some anecdotal, clinical, or autobiographical observations in the following. It is likely or possible that females with autism may show more social interest and motivation, heightened emotion contagion or affective empathy, increased imagination, more friendships but with different quality, greater camouflaging of social difficulties, and different contents of narrow interests. I have to say that these are mainly from anecdotal clinical reports, and at this stage, we still do not have large-scale epidemiologically based or large-scale clinical studies that have confirmed that these are a universal phenomenon. So let's look into some examples here. So for this bar graph, it represents a study finding in teenagers enrolled in special education. The researchers measuring their friendship quality using a tool called Friendship Quality Scale. As you can see, comparing teenagers with autism versus non-autistic teenagers, they actually show quite different patterns in different domains of friendship. For example, in terms of feeling of companionship, there's increased feeling of companionship actually in autistic boys and autistic girls compared to non-autistic. Hello, there was a connection. Sorry about that. So let's go back to this bar graph. For the help domain, you can see that actually autistic boys rated their friendships to be less helpful compared to non-autistic boys. However, there's no group differences in the girls, whether you're autistic or not. And there's a similar trend of that in the closeness, feeling of closeness. On the other hand, there seems to be some domain that the effects of gender actually are larger than the effects of diagnosis. So this study is the first of its kind looking into possible differences compared to neurotypical individuals in terms of friendship qualities. And we do need more studies into the more fine-grained details of this. Another example here is about camouflaging. So when people refer to the term camouflaging, it is used to describe a strategy used for social coping. Like, if I'm on the spectrum, how do I cope with the social situations that tends to be unpredictable and generally difficult? There was a study that using survey-based method led by Laura Hall at UCL. In this study, we asked participants about their experiences with camouflaging. And we used qualitative research method to analyze the major themes coming out of this. Across the board, the participants described the intention of camouflaging or social coping is really to assimilate into the neurotypical world and to get connected. The strategies they used include compensation, for example, learning how to maintain a conversation, forcing oneself to use eye contact, forcing oneself to use gestures in conversation. There could be strategies as masking, for example, inhibiting the repetitive behaviors or stimming. The consequences of camouflaging, however, tend to be sometimes positive, but also quite negative in terms of the exhaustion that has been brought to it. It might also bring into some doubt into self-identity. It is also worth mentioning that there are increased clinicians' reports about And also, participants report about different contents of narrow interest. So, for example, it has been reported that females on the spectrum may have narrow interests that's more related to animals, to the human world, to cultures, and so on. It's not necessarily dinosaurs, rockets, trains, or transportation systems. So it is important for people to recognize the intensity and exclusivity of the narrow interest, so not to be too biased by the content. Move forward. Another question about how sex and gender moderates the presentation or identification of autism is the claim that autism are under-recognized in girls. And it's actually quite likely. Some related to what we call the diagnostician's expectancy bias, but also could be gender-based bias. The classical example really comes from this population-based twin sample studies led by Dortinsky et al. From Francesca Hepp's group. In the study, using the TED sample in the UK, they compared girls and boys with similar levels of autistic traits measured by the CAST, but with or without the clinical diagnosis of autism. As you can see, for the boys who have high CAST scores compared to those who have high CAST scores and the clinical diagnosis of autism, those who have a diagnosis are more likely to have concurrent issues related to behavior and cognitive difficulties. Nevertheless, this difference seems to be greater in the female population, meaning that it's possible that girls require more concurrent behavioral or cognitive issues for them to receive a clinical diagnosis of autism, even if they have similarly high level of autistic traits. This finding has been recently replicated in the Dutch sample led by Duvekot et al. Basically, in the clinical sample, what was found was females required higher levels of emotional and behavioral difficulties for them to get a clinical diagnosis. Now, let's move forward to the second angle, looking into how sex and gender moderates the emergence of autism. In terms of the general mechanisms underlying what we call female protection, there is this claim that females need more risk hits or biological changes to develop autism. The findings tend to be showing that it depends on the aspect of biology that one looks into. So the general idea comes from this model, which is a multifactorial liability model explaining conditions that has a sex bias in prevalence. So assuming the liability to autism, which could be genetic or non-genetic, are normally distributed in the population. And given the fact that we know there are more males who are diagnosed with autism, one can presume that the threshold for a person to reach the diagnostic threshold would be higher if the person is in a female sex. And based on that assumption, one would assume that females who got the clinical diagnosis may have more risk hits or higher liability for autism, given that being female itself already includes some general protective mechanisms. The genetic findings show that if it is really the case that females tend to show higher levels of genetic mutations when it is compared to males. And we call this a quantitative model, suggesting that the female protection comes from a general protective mechanism, so generally females require more risk hits for them to develop autism. However, it is worth noting that we require a large sample for these genetic signals to become obvious and evident that can be detected. Nevertheless, in the genetic literature, it is confirmed, or at the very least, highly supported, that females on the spectrum tended to have higher levels of different kinds of genetic changes related to the clinical diagnosis. However, it seems to be a different story when it comes to neurobiology or other aspects of biology. And this is a hypothesis we called there are qualitative different neural routes to autism. So one representative study is this one taken from the ABIDE dataset, which included a moderate size, but one of the largest size of females with autism, which is about 53. What they found was that in terms of the brain structural measures, they did not find any main effects of diagnosis or sex or gender, but they recognized a sex by diagnosis interaction in how the cortex are folded in the orbital frontal cortex, suggesting that the effect of autism in terms of neurobiology seems to depend highly on one being male or female. The similar kind of sex by diagnosis interaction has also been found by a range of other different studies with sample sizes smaller or slightly larger than this study. There's also another study based on the U.S. Autism Center of Excellence sample, suggesting that when you combine information from the gray matter geometry as well as the white matter connectivity, it is the white matter connectivity pattern that contributes the most to the sex by diagnosis interaction. And this happens mainly in the temporal regions and the posterior medial cortical regions. So again, this marks the possibility that when it comes to biology of autism, or brain immune measures, the effect of autism seems to be highly dependent on one being sex or gender. If we dive into this possibility about mechanisms contributing to the emergence of autism may be partly related to mechanisms contributing to sex differences, the observation is that it is actually a very complicated story. But it seems to be the case that the convergence of pathways are a key direction for future investigation. This is a study led by our very own Professor Christine Ecke, also in the EU-AMS consortium. What we did here is that there was a model that has been constructed to predict the person's biological sex based on their neurobiology in terms of cortical thickness. And this model will predict the person's likelihood being male or female on a dimension. So it's not a binary one, but a spectrum. Now, it has been shown that in the sample, if a person's brain are more likely to be predicted to be a biological male, there's higher likelihood that the person would also have autism phenotype. And that has been found in females and male sample. So there are some suggestion, although this is a cross-section data, there's some suggestion that the male neuroanatomical brain phenotype is correlated or even predictive of a probability of a person being diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder. On to the other levels of examination, there's also possible convergence. There are researchers looking into the brain gene expression pattern. They found that genes that are more expressed in males do not themselves overlap with autism candidate genes. However, those male sex-biased genes pathways are implicated by autism candidate genes. And what is more interesting is that the overlap seems to lie in mechanisms related to immunological processes. For example, gene expression related to astrocytes and microglia, which are the immune cells in the brain. So this brings an interesting angle looking into the issue related to vulnerability to autism, sex differentiation, and inflammatory processes. McGarcy and colleagues have discovered that in the rat brain, in the region that has been historically shown to be sexually dimorphic in size, which is the POA, there are actually sex differences in terms of the type of the immunological cells, the microglia. And what is more interesting is that this process is mediated by immunological or inflammatory molecules, for example, PGE2. So based on this hypothesis, McMcCarthy and colleagues proposed that it is likely that a sex differentiation process that happened prenatally are mediated by inflammatory process, in which case, in normative male versus normative female, normative male tend to have increased inflammatory process in the brain. Now, if there's other factors contributing to an even increased inflammation or disturbance, then it actually brings heightened effect, which might result in a higher likelihood of having autism spectrum disorder. This also corresponds to the increasing evidence showing that maternal immune activation during the womb can be a risk factor for increasing likelihood of autism as well as other neurodevelopmental conditions in humans. This is a field that has started to dive into different mechanisms, but we do not really have a conclusion yet. So I have to say that this is a purely hypothetical model and it's purely personal perspective. What I would suggest is that if we look at these blue boxes, these are more or less known factors related to the emergence of autism that are not necessarily directly related to sex and gender related variables. We know de novo mutations play significant roles. We know immune activation plays significant roles as well, and also likely the metabolic changes. Now, there are also other factors that sex-related variables or gender-related variables may play a moderating role. For example, there are studies showing that there are different common variants that are mostly associated with autism. And interestingly, these common variants are actually more likely to be the variants related to genetic contributions to anthropometric traits that are different in males and females. There are also other studies showing that prenatal hormonal processes may actually be related to slightly heightened risk for neurodevelopmental conditions, including autism and ADHD. And these data are from the Danish or Swedish population-based sample. There are also animal studies showing that it could be the interaction of a prenatal process and de novo mutation and the participant or the animal sex contributing to autism. What has not been examined in detail are the roles of gender-related factors in terms of the emergence of autism or the developmental patterns of autism. I would like to provide some interim conclusions about the questions that was raised in the first place. So, autism, yes, is a male-predominant condition, but the ratio might not be that substantial. It's more likely to be 3-to-1 if the ascertainment bias can be addressed. Girls and women may present their autism differently from boys and men, but probably it is more likely to be behavior presentation level. Although we're still not sure whether the organization of autism core symptoms and associated characteristics such as anxiety or emotion regulation are different by sex or gender. But what we do know is that the behavior presentation may differ a lot between the two genders, and the gender environment may matter a lot. And also, the gender context may actually have a significant impact to the identification and recognition of autism. In terms of etiological implications, the exact protective mechanisms and risk mechanisms are still unclear, even though we know that there is very likely a female protective effect for autism. Perhaps there are some convergence of mechanisms contributing to autism as well as typical sex or gender differentiation, and this may likely to be due to the interplay of genetics and environment. However, we still need a lot of research into this area to understand what are the specific mechanisms that work together contributing to the development and emergence of autism. I would say the take-home message for us is that although we are based on the studies treating sex or gender as a binary variable, it is becoming clearer that the mechanisms related to sex and gender are diverse. We should treat sex and gender as a collection of different variables and then analyze how these variables modulate or contribute to the emergence, the behavior presentation, the identification, and the support that we provide for persons on the autism spectrum with different sexes and genders. Thank you very much, and I'm glad to have this opportunity to share with you some of the thoughts, and I welcome questions and answers and discussions.
Thank you very much for a fascinating and clear talk, Meng-Chuan. Are there any questions? If you have any questions, please use the Q&A button at the top or post your question in the public chat. If there aren't any questions from the audience at the moment, I will continue with some questions we've received in advance of the talk. So Meng-Chuan, you suggested there are several factors that may lead to differences in biology and clinical phenotype underlying autism in males and females. Would it still be preferable to consider those then as different subgroups of autism, or would the female form be a different neurodevelopmental condition?
Thank you, Amber. I think this is a great question, and this actually stimulates our reflection of what defines autism. So I would say this is more of a definition issue rather than a empirical issue. And I would like to bring this back to the differences that I mentioned regarding sexual dimorphism and sex differences. Now, let's say the male-female or sex-gender differences found in the autism population are mostly on average differences. I think the implication is that sex and gender-related variables may have a contribution to the phenotypes or the neurobiology of autism. However, if we find it to be the case that males and females present quite clear difference in the characteristics, and from those individual characteristics, you can tell whether this is a male with autism or female with autism. That provides more stronger argument to say that autism in the two different or more different sex and genders should be considered different conditions. So it's really about the level of differences, the effect sizes of differences that we found, and whether it is more like an on average difference or it's a dimorphic condition.
Thank you very much. Another question, if there are any questions from the audience, please just post them in the public chat. Otherwise, I'll continue with the previous.
Yeah. Amber, I think there are 2 questions posted in the Q&A section.
Oh, great. Perfect.
So I will probably just read this out loud. So we have a first question. Is there anything known about gender fluidity specifically in autism compared to typically developing population? That's a great question as well. As far as I know, we've got 2 larger scale survey and some smaller scale studies that started to show larger gender diversity or gender fluidity. So the surveys came from, really both are published just this year, one from the Netherlands and the other from Australia, showing that in terms of gender identity, autistic adults and males and females, biological males and females, reported there's a higher rate of reporting transgender, genderqueer, bigender, gender fluid, or other gender identity compared to the identity or compared to the cisgender identity. So this is what has been observed, and in some smaller scale study, there are also associations between gender atypicality and autism spectrum trait. Now, it is difficult to probably to analyze what are the reasons contributing to this observation. It could be quite developmental or identity developmental perspective. So it could be the case that being on the spectrum makes one less likely to adhere to the gendered context, and then less affected by the demands of the gender stereotype, and therefore it brings up more reflections about one's gender expression or identity, leading to what is called gender diversity. But there could also be some possible biological link between the two that has not really been approved so far. So this is what I know from the literature about gender fluidity and autism. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Meng-Chuan. Would you like to answer the question by Matthew?
Yes. So the second question is, given mutual independence of systemizing and empathizing traits and abilities in females, but inverse dependence in males, high systemizing females may be more able to compensate for low empathizing. Yes? Unclear how much of this independence is sex-driven and how much gendered culture-driven. Large potential for cross-cultural studies. Yes, definitely. Thank you, Matthew, for this question. I think it might be the case that the compensation mechanisms that we found so far for women on the spectrum, especially those who are diagnosed late on the spectrum, may be related to different cognitive constructs underlying different cognitive constructs by sex underlying their ability to compensate or their characteristics related to autism. I believe, apart from what you mentioned, Matthew, there are also other studies about facial recognition differences that it also showed some sex-dependent patterns in terms of traits of autism to facial recognition abilities by sex. I believe that was from David Skew's group in London. So it is likely that there are sex or gender-dependent cognitive constructs serving the basis of the behavioral sex or gender differences that we discovered. And definitely, whether it comes from sex or whether it comes from the variables related to gender, is an empirical study that has to be carried out.
Thank you, Meng-Chuan. And so there are a couple of questions from Jan Buitelaar. The first question is, are there any historical trends in the male-female ratio in autism?
Yes, this is a great question. So if we recall the literature in the past, let's say from Leo Kanner or Asperger, the male-female ratio is actually quite high. And even in the 90s, I think it was mostly believed that the sex ratio for Asperger's syndrome is about 8 to 10 to 1 from Christopher Gilbert's study. So it has been quite high in perhaps 20 years ago. But for example, there's one important Danish registry study published 3 years ago showing that by the ICD-10 diagnosis, the sex ratio of autistic disorder remains similar across 15 years from the 90s till now at about 4 to 1. But the ratio for Asperger's syndrome in ICD-10 or PDD-NOS actually drops substantially from 8 to 1 to now it's about 3 to 1. So definitely, at least in the Nordic countries, there is a decreased sex ratio or gender ratio in terms of the diagnosis given for what we used to call the higher functioning end, which is Asperger's syndrome or PDD-NOS. So it might be the case that there are increased awareness of the higher functioning, quote unquote, presentation in females, leading to a better recognition. And this is the only study that I'm aware of in terms of analyzing the historical trends for sex ratio. But I mean, there might be others that I'm not aware of.
Great, that's very interesting. So Jan's second question was, are the differences in presentation in males and females with autism, are they controlled by comorbidities or other factors, you think?
Yeah, it's a great one again. So I think using the standardized measure, for example, ADI-R, ADOS, or others, the only consistent finding, as I said, would be the lower repetitive stereotype behaviors. And in that case, people have controlled for intellectual disability or IQ at the very least. They do not necessarily control for other comorbidities. And it is actually various whether in those samples, males and females have, whether either of them having higher comorbid anxiety, depression, or other things. But I have to say that the sex differences or gender differences measured by these standardized instruments do not seem to be very consistent. And especially in the social communication domains, the differences, if any, are highly dependent on intellectual ability or even other comorbidity. So the effect is not huge.
Okay. And then Jan's last question was, is the prognosis and course different for boys and girls with autism?
That's a great question, and I don't think we have a clear answer so far. So for those who are diagnosed early in life, for example, an inception cohort from toddler stage, I don't think we have enough data to address that issue. The longitudinal follow-up, for example, from the 70s by the famous Pat-Hollin cohort or other North America or Canadian cohort are mostly males, so it's difficult to make a male-female distinction. When I say long-term follow-up, it's like more than 20 years follow-up. The inception early follow-up cohort, for example, the pathway study in Canada, is beginning to address this issue, but so far, at the very least, for comorbidity, the only finding would be higher internalizing symptoms in girls who are diagnosed early in life. It is still not known whether this pattern persisted into adolescence. It will be very interesting to look into infant sibling cohort, for example, the BSRC data or the BASIS data, that whether the trajectories of girls and boys are different. There's some initial analysis from Daniel Messinger using the BSRC data published 2 years ago, showing that at the very least, in the early stages of life, the sex differences, if any, are reflecting the neurotypical sex differences rather than specific sex-dependent trajectory. However, I think one thing we don't know is that girls tend to be diagnosed later compared to boys, and there are actually more so-called girls or women without intellectual disability diagnosed in teenage or adulthood. So it is likely that there are some sex or gender-dependent trajectories in those who are diagnosed later in life, but not early in life. There are some anecdotal reports about higher possibility of misdiagnosis for girls and women on the spectrum who are diagnosed later in life, but there's still no population level or administrative data on this, and that's what we're currently trying to do now.
Great, thank you. Are there any other questions from the audience? I have another final question, if that's okay. Now with the new diagnosis of social communication disorder in DSM-5, do you think it's likely that more females will be classified as having social communication condition rather than autism?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, it has been suspected to be like that because people suspect that the DSM-5 ASD is more stringent than the DSM-4 PDD. Therefore, people who do not fall into DSM-5 ASD will instead fall into DSM-5 SPCD. And some of the reanalysis of the Korean data set from Kim et al. Actually show that pattern. However, one recent study using a 3DI data set from Will Mandy looking into the diagnosis of SCD versus ASD and analyzing that across sex does not show significant differences in terms of sex differences in terms of those who are classified in SCD compared to those who are classified into ASD. So I would suggest that this might be an empirical question to answer using prospective epidemiological studies, especially in the surveillance data in the U.S. Because if we found the increased rates of girls being diagnosed with SCD rather than ASD, and then that actually may imply what you have just suggested. And actually, the Mandy et al. Study on SCD actually showed that there's there does not seem to be qualitative differences between SDD and ASD in general, and SDD may be a minor presentation of the social communication issues with ASD. So this is a great empirical question that still awaits further investigation.
Great, thank you. That's very interesting. If there are no other questions, I would like to thank Meng-Chuan again for a fantastic talk, and thank you for answering all the questions.
Thank you.
It's been very fascinating to learn from you. Thanks as well to all the participants for attending, and we look forward to seeing you at our next webinar, which should take place in November, and you should receive more information on that via email. Thank you, Meng-Chuan.
Thank you very much. Have a good day.